It started out as a home to one of the most famous sons of Virginia. Today it is one of the most iconic representations of the sacrifice of this nation's sons and daughters for the freedom and liberties we now enjoy. It is the final resting place of more than 400,000 veterans of this nation's conflicts, and includes presidents and generals, Medal of Honor recipients, and your average everyday G.I. Joe and Jane. But more than anything else, Arlington National Cemetery represents the citizen, soldier, and airman whose commitment and dedication helped to shape this nation from the beginning. The story of Arlington National Cemetery begins at this very location more than 150 years ago. This is the porch of Arlington House, which at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 was the property of Mary Custis Lee, a descendant of Founding Father and first President of the United States George Washington, and wife of United States Army Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, former Superintendent of the United States Military Academy and at that time commander of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment.
The property never actually belonged to Robert E. Lee. So George Washington Parke Custis, who is George Washington's adopted son, it's really his grandson, but it's his adopted son, established this plantation and built the Arlington House between 1802 and 1818 to honor George Washington. His only surviving daughter married then Lieutenant Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army. So Lee never owned the property, but certainly this was his home from the time he married Mary Custis, all through his service in the U.S. Army.
Lee had to make a painful decision, a critical life decision, to resign his commission and go with the Confederacy, knowing that Virginia was on the verge of secession and Maryland also was on the verge of secession, meant that Army planners had to defend the city of Washington.
They say location is everything, and Arlington House possessed one of the more spectacular views of the nation's capital, situated on the high ground across the river from Washington City. It was important ground for the Union to possess.
In 1861, it was critical to seize this property to defend Washington, D.C., not only from that kind of threat, but essentially all the roads that came in through Virginia were very close to this ridge. So whoever commanded this ridge commanded the approaches and had the definitive high ground over Washington, D.C.
Initially, it was it's high ground, so strategically it was important. The initial military defensive positions were begun, and the construction was begun right around the bridgeheads themselves. There was no thought to actually protect the bridgeheads further. The senior officer in command of the militia was Major General Charles Sanford from New York. So he was the senior guy. Most of the troops in D.C. were from New York, so he was the senior tactical commander.
Among the first acts of the Army was to secure the hills on the Virginia side and create defenses. So Lee's Arlington House and Arlington itself soon became part of a network of forts, the defenses of Washington.
He knew it was the Arlington, he knew it was the Lee home, and he decided to make it his headquarters as a way to protect it.
As the war between the states raged on, casualties mounted, filling hospitals and cemeteries on both sides. In November of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln spoke at the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But although Gettysburg solved the problem of where to bury the war dead of just one battle, it didn't address the larger problem which was growing in Washington.
In 1864, when the decision was made to begin burying soldiers here, the war had entered some of its bloodiest phases. Battles of Antietam in 1862, Chancellorsville in 1863, Gettysburg in 1863, and the Wilderness were ongoing, providing numbers of casualties, many of whom could not be transported home to their home states.
By 1864, the national cemeteries that had been established here, so the Soldiers' Home, which today is in the northern part of the district, and the National Cemetery in Alexandria were simply filled really beyond capacity. Because if you think about how military evacuation worked in the Civil War, wounded soldiers, ill soldiers, if they survived those immediate hours and days after being wounded or after becoming sick, they end up at a hospital back in Washington, D.C. So just the number of deaths here in the district overwhelmed the capability of the surrounding area to support all of those burials. And that necessity began really at the beginning of May of 1864. So our very first military burial here was May 13th, 1864.
The first burials here were of Pennsylvania volunteers. So it was a direct connection to what we know as the militia today through the Pennsylvania volunteer regiments. And the very first soldiers were buried in May 13th. It would have been Private William Chrisman from the 67th Pennsylvania Infantry and Private William McKinney from the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And on the Pennsylvania side, there would have been volunteers.
A few months ago, when my cousin gave me a call and said, hey, I have some interesting news regarding a family member who happens to be the first soldier buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
Well, his brother Barnabas was killed in action in Virginia, and we feel that, we don't know for sure, but we feel by looking back that he joined partly in tribute to Barnabas and partly to help his family because they were experiencing some difficult times.
You know, that a family member, answered the call back during the Civil War, and unfortunately his time in the military was short. It was only a few months when he passed on May 11th, 150 years ago.
He became ill shortly after they arrived here, and he was hospitalized with measles. And during the course of that hospitalization, he developed peritonitis, which is an inflammation of the bowel, and never survived.
And what's nice is, Arlington didn't forget him.
Tradition is everything at Arlington National Cemetery. Nowhere is this more evident than at the Tomb of the Unknowns, which is guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, come rain or come shine. Those who volunteer for this duty are members of the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment, also known as the Old Guard, with a lineage that dates back to 1784. Another institution with a lineage that dates back even farther is the National Guard, which is descended from state militia units formed almost 150 years earlier. 3 soldiers who have served with both institutions know the importance of tradition and how that tradition translates to any unit in the armed forces.
Discipline and attention to detail. That's the one thing that you really learn different from any other unit is the discipline. The hours that you spend on making sure when you put your uniform on and you represent the United States Army, that you represent perfection and that we project an unbelievable appearance to the public. Everything I learned in the Old Guard, just going through the different phases of leadership, team leader, squad leader, platoon sergeant, now first sergeant for Arlington Hall Station, it was all because of the discipline and the attention to detail that I learned here in the Old Guard.
I have a collective of experience, meaning from my deployment to the tomb, and then to bring all that to the National Guard. And the main thing I bring is discipline and humbleness. And that's the 2 main things you learn being a tomb guard, is that discipline is highly needed, and when you must be humble about this job, because sometimes your mind can stretch to think that you're bigger than the job. So humbleness is very important to have as a tomb guard and understand what's the purpose of the mission.
The big thing that soldiers learn when they come here is attention to detail and discipline. And it's one of the things that's really psychologically ingrained into every soldier because you practice and practice and practice, because perfection is the only acceptable standard here. I mean, being a soldier here, you live the Army values 24/7. And the discipline and the attention to detail you obviously take with you, and it becomes a part of who you are. And when I became a platoon sergeant, everyone knew that there was a different standard from from my lowest ranking private up to our battalion sergeant major. They knew that our platoon was different, and it was, I think, because of not only me, but I had soldiers in my platoon that had served in the old guard too.
Being a tomb guard, you have to understand whether you're in uniform or out of uniform, you still represent the United States Army, and you also represent the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Before coming to the cemetery, I didn't wear my uniform with as much pride as I do now. So what the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier has allowed me to do is appreciate the uniform a lot better than I did before. Now, before coming here, I was deployed. I was on a 15-month deployment with 3rd ID. However, just being here at the tomb around so much history is so impelling to know that you're a part of something that's bigger than you and that's appreciated by the United States of America.
When you're standing there holding the flag right about three or 4 feet away in front of the family, you can hear their conversations and you can hear them crying. And so it's extremely hard to not get emotional, but it's one of those things that you have to bury inside of you because you have to maintain your ceremonial composure.
To me, there is no greater honor than to serve your country and then to die for your country. But you got to remember, the unknowns, they not only served their country and died for their country, but they basically gave up their name for their country because no one even knows who they are. You know, when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're standing guard up there, no one's there to watch you, no one's there to see. You're there pulling guard to honor those who served their country, died for our country, and lost their names or gave up their names for our country. There is no more peaceful place on earth to me than Arlington Cemetery.
Always remember that their units are living things. Our units, their units, go back in time to the date they were first organized within their state or territory, and that soldiers and airmen in those units fought and died, and some of them are here, and that there's a very real connection. It's just not something on paper. It's something, it's part of their soul. It's what gives their unit life. The whole idea of a memorial is just that, to remember.
When I think about taps, I think about the cemetery and where it all started. And it all started in the Civil War. The first playing of taps was during a Peninsula campaign outside of Richmond in 1862. Of course, the cemetery was founded in 1864, 150 years ago. And again, because I'm a big history buff, the Civil War is really the pinnacle of American history. It made us what we are today.
In the conflict in which the citizens of the United States took up arms against each other, a place of final healing and a binding of the nation's wounds would take place here in Arlington. Arlington National Cemetery continues to tell a complex story to this day. Like the many citizen soldiers and airmen who served their country with honor, the cemetery itself is a representation of this country's service to our nation's citizens first and foremost. May they all rest in peace.